Okay, so thank you very much, everybody, for coming this morning. And today's lecture, we're going to focus on the practical side of multimodal data. We will go in more depth later in the week, unpacking some of the characteristics of multimodal data. But yesterday's lecture, we looked really at the conceptual and theoretical aspects of what is process data, how do we define it. And today we're going to look at more of the practical side of it, about the characteristics of process data and its uses. And we'll, at the end of yesterday's lecture, we began to look at the different uses of process data. And I want to spend a little bit of time also unpacking and expanding on the different uses today. So it's really in two parts. The first part, we'll look at the different types of process data. We'll begin to look at them. We will look at them in more depth later in the week, as I say. And then the second part, we'll look at the different uses that we can put process data to in assessment. So that's the plan. Okay, just to remind you, yesterday we had this quite complicated working definition that I proposed, that response process data support the valid and reliable interpretation and use of evidence on the cognitive and affective dimensions of test taking, with respect to the temporal, situated, embodied, material, and interactive characteristics of test performance. Now, as my working definition, the feedback yesterday was really helpful from the group around the fact that while the beginning of that sentence makes a lot of sense, the rest of it is a little bit too heavy. So I think in retrospect, I'll break that up into two sentences. It is a bit wordy. So yesterday I was having a bit of a think about, would there be an easier way to say this? Surprisingly, I looked historically at some interesting data. And I found that actually Ella Fitzgerald in the song "Tain't What You Do, It's the Way That You Do It" from 1939 seems to capture my definition pretty well. I'm not going to try and sing the song this morning, but I think her lyrics capture it quite well. So "Tain't what you do, it's the way that you do it" is the first verse, and then the second verse, "Tain't what you do, it's the time that you do it." So there's an action in the first verse and the temporal dimensions in the second. You can try hard, it don't mean a thing. There's issues there about test engagement and effort. And then saying, take it easy. Okay, so don't be too stressed. There's test anxiety issues coming in there. And then they introduce it's the tain't what you do, it's the place that you do it. So time and place and way all get combined, and that's what gets results. And I thought that actually captures, interestingly, some of the different dimensions of process data and the definition. So thank you, Ella Fitzgerald, and others who've performed that song from around 1939. And just to also expand, to rehearse yesterday's discussion about my sort of working model of process data. This was my working model here, where we're concerned in process data with what happens inside the red area. In that my definition relates to the specific characteristics of the testing situation. So it's in temporal, embodied, material, interactive characteristics, which includes what we might think of cognition, but also emotions, affect, etc. And what I tried to argue yesterday is that although wider test ecology is certainly relevant to the testing situation, my argument would be that process data should have characteristics which reflect the actual testing situation rather than some abstract characteristics of, like, for example, group membership. Group membership, I think, is relevant to our understanding of response processes, absolutely. But I don't feel that on its own it is sufficient to qualify as response process data. So yeah, that was just to rehearse and clarify that point. All right then. So if we now look at the different sources of multimodal process data, we can identify these following sources. My view is that process data works best, and I'll explain why today, when it's multimodal. In other words, we don't just use one source of process data, but we use different modes of process data. And the reason for that is that many of these sources are subject to partiality and bias. So various forms of measurement error, let's put it that way. Like all assessment data is subject to various sources of measurement error, but process data is particularly prone, I think, to partiality in particular, and also wider sources of error, which I'll discuss later in the week. So let me just run through some of those. So the one that is perhaps most familiar to people who work in computer-based testing is log data, which may include, for example, data which we can use to calculate, for example, item response times. And we can look at keystrokes, patterns of keystrokes, and also the content of what people type in the click stream. So we can capture the temporal aspects of how long they take to do a particular item or a component of an item. We can look at their navigation patterns through the click stream, certain characteristics of the keystroke and what they actually type. So there's quite rich data there that can be mined for us to make inferences about certain aspects of user experience or test performance, for example. Okay, so alongside that, we have a number of other sources, which I think can sometimes be more difficult to collect. The thing about log data in computer-based testing, aside from the ethical issues, is that it's routinely collected. Now, of course, it's routinely collected, but actually using the data requires that data to be processed and cleaned, etc. And so that's a time-consuming and difficult process. But it's still routinely collected. So the advantage of log data is that it's a very large scale. We're talking about big data there in the true sense of big data. A lot of different, many different responses per individual, and if you multiply them across all the participants in a particular test or examination, you're getting into very big data there. And so it requires a very systematic approach towards its collection and analysis. But there are a number of other methods which I think which are becoming routinely used. Now, one of them is eye tracking. The distinction I would make there between eye tracking and log data is in normal cases with current technology, eye tracking is an additional piece of research that people do to support usually the development of computer-based tests, but it also can be used for wearable eye trackers, can also be used for research and paper-based assessments, and I've done that as well. So eye tracking provides some very interesting data about the ways in which people engage with the item and with the platform. Sometimes collecting data, which is, well, very often collecting data which is not present in the log files. So we're talking there about activity between the clicks. That's how I think of it. So there's no keystrokes, no mouse movements going on. But when we see somebody, for example, reading the instructions of a test item or moving between various content on the screen, we can build up a very nice picture of how people engage with a particular test item. And from that, we can develop, we can model, for example, response processes across different groups and different levels of ability. From that, we can also make inferences about user experience and design-related issues about how items are designed to make them accessible, and so that the navigation and user experience is at the appropriate level. Okay, third one there is video and audio recording. Again, it's not usually routinely collected, although some assessments in some countries now routinely use audio recording for quality assurance purposes. Yeah, that could be very large scale data routinely used. Usually for video data is not used for those not used widely because of the it's a little bit invasive in terms of personal data. But there are some contexts when it is used, for example, in high stakes assessments and remote proctoring, where video is a compulsory aspect of remote proctoring. So I think increasingly video and audio data is collected as part of the test administration. But then, of course, it raises questions about the legitimate ways in which that's used. One of the advantages of video data is it can capture a number of different things which are interesting in terms of understanding the response processes, the cognitive and affective, particularly the affective characteristics. So, for example, facial expressions could be captured, gesture and body movements can be captured, which all can be used to tell us something about how people are engaging with the test and with particular items. So that's audio, video and audio. There's also increasingly a movement towards wearable sensors, which can capture things like movement and physiological data, such as heart rate, for example, which people can use to again generate inferences about test taking, variation in response data. I feel personally that it's very dependent on theoretical models about test taking, which are not yet very well developed in terms of their routine use in testing. These are absolutely, I think, at the forefront of innovation and still really being developed in terms of their, let's say, the validity of the inferences which are generated from wearable sensors. Okay, now going back in time a little bit, more established methods would be retrospective think aloud, where people, talk out loud as they're doing a test item. It's usually part of test development. Although I think you can also use it for example, when a test is going to be used for a different audience, a different set of participants, where you might want to look at how people are engaging with the test item content, etc. Where people provide their thinking explanations for how they're engaging with the test. And then there's an even more low-tech approach, which personally I think is undervalued, which is simple observation, where researchers sit and observe people taking tests. And from that, they're able to actually capture quite a lot of inferences about how people are engaging with the test, about body posture, about interaction, verbalizations. One of the things I've noticed, for example, in my research, is that, for example, an observer can see when people blush or when they perspire. So that's not easily captured, certainly not captured in log data. And even with video analysis, the observer of videos may miss the slight blushing that goes on, for example, when somebody's feeling a bit stressed. And so as an observer, I'm able to see, I think this person's looking a bit stressed. And as an observer, you build up a sense of what's going on over time. And you can see from people's body language, from the for example, blushing, how they engage with the items, that, for example, they may be looking stressed at a particular moment or tired, as fatigue comes in. So observation, I think, is extremely valuable. And that observation, of course, is extended through things like eye tracking and video, where we can dig deeper into explanations for some of these behaviors. Okay, moving on swiftly. Let's then look at briefly at log data around response times. So this is from WISE, and there's a number of very good publications which have looked at the use of log data on response times to make inferences about how people are engaging with test items. And they're particularly concerned with, I think, on response times with, well, I think it's kind of the low-hanging fruit of response times around disengagement. So, for example, is there a particularly rapid, do particularly rapid responses on test items indicate disengagement? And there's some really nice work where they've shown that certain response times, which are very rapid, actually do signify and signal, in most cases, some user disengagement on an item. And so it come with that. There's a sort of graph of response times looks a bit like this, where you have on the response times a small cluster, usually a small one, of very rapid responses on an item. And researchers can then work out, well, is it realistic to assume that somebody has read the test item content and had time to respond to an item? Or is it more realistic to interpret that as a form of guessing and disengagement? What we don't see in that graph is a disaggregation of who gets the item correct and incorrect. And personally, I feel that that's an important aspect of it. I'm not sure that response times on their own, without looking at whether something is correct or incorrect, really tell us enough. And again, in my own observations, I found that actually sometimes people do very rapid responses, which are kind of outliers in relation to the main set of participants, where people are just extremely knowledgeable about a topic. And so for example, you would get rapid response times at the lower end of the spectrum, where people might say, well, I have no idea how to do this, I'm just going to guess. Or people who are fatigued, for example, who just don't want to engage for whatever reason. But you can also get rapid responses from people who actually are just very knowledgeable about a topic and can get the answer really quickly in comparison to everybody else. And so I think it's important to disaggregate that data and to look at the proportion of people, for example, who get items correct. Of course, when it's multiple choice, you might argue that there's a certain proportion of people who are going to guess it correct anyway, and so it's not necessarily an informed answer. So now I'll take a brief look at eye tracking in video. So the image on the left there is a sketch produced from some of my research with the Ministry of Education in France, where we're doing eye tracking and video, looking at how people engage with in secondary schools with mathematics test items, computer-based mathematics test items. And it's very interesting in that data how we have a relationship between what appears on the screen, what goes on the screen, what the eye tracker captures, and what the video captures. So I'll just give some examples here of some of the data. So here on the left-hand side, you have an image of somebody looking down with their hand on their head. I know, if I was to ask you whether this person is engaged or disengaged in this particular computer-based test, I would guess that some of you might say, well, this person's disengaged. And certainly on the right-hand side there of the screen, you can see some data from the eye tracking software where you can see gaps in the data. So the white lines along the bottom there indicate gaze data when the gaze data is present or missing. So the white bands are gaze data that's present, and the gaps between them are gaze data that's missing. So the question is, what's happening when there's missing data? And I think that one of the explanations is that the person is looking away from the screen, away from the eye tracker, so it's not picking up their eye movements. So we looked in the French data at what was actually going on. And very often what we found was that person is not actually disengaged, but they're using pen and paper. So with mathematics items in particular, people tend to work out complex mathematical tasks using pen and paper. And you can see on this, the image in the middle, that you've got it's picking up data from the online use of an online calculator, and these red blobs, red circles are eye tracking data on fixation. So you can see what the person's been looking at. But just behind that, you can see they've actually been using an online note-taking tool to sketch out their answers. But in many cases, people will actually use pen and paper. So that actually raises some quite profound issues around mode, because people assume that we move from paper to computer, we're moving from one mode to the other. But I would argue that in many cases, what we're doing is we're adding an additional mode. So computer-based tests normally take place, people are interacting with the computer, with the information on the computer, but very often they're also interacting with pen and paper. And so we have to consider how that might be an important data source too. And the quote there on the right-hand side is information that came later as retrospective think aloud when we were asking the participant about how they came to a particular answer for the particular item. So how they talk about it, how they represent it, could be captured too. So it's very much multimodal, and in this case, where it shows how we can use, for example, eye tracking data alongside video data around facial expression and gesture. And there's some other pictures there of various kinds of facial expression and gesture, some of which I'll talk about tomorrow in relation to validity. But very often we can pick up from people's facial expression and gesture certain aspects of, for example, their affective state. So on the right-hand side there, you can see somebody who's kind of celebrating success in a test item. And on the left-hand side, a more subtle, but nevertheless useful inference that can be generated about somebody being happy about the particular test item. So I'm just going to give now some brief examples. Yesterday, when we looked at the different uses of process data, which we have here, and this next example relates to how we can use process data for quality control and remote proctoring. In this case, it wasn't remote proctoring. It was actually when I was actually present. A very brief example here, return to my research with UNESCO in Mongolia in the LAMP Literacy Assessment and Monitoring Program, household-based assessment of adult literacy and numeracy. And here's a brief transcript here from a recording that took place in Mongolia. And what you can see here is a respondent and interviewer, and also the respondent's daughter who was present, and in fact the respondent's wife was also present in the same situation. And what this is picking up here is actually an interaction between the respondent and interviewer, where the respondent was trying to involve the family members in helping him to complete the test item, and the interviewer was trying to prevent it. So you know, the father is trying to involve the daughter. The daughter is willing and wants to support the father, and the interviewer is saying, no, you can't help him. Why not go and watch TV? So in terms of protocols, the interviewer was following the protocols very well, because she was trying to prevent other family members from helping the respondent to complete the item. And in many ways, in terms of test ecology, it reflects valid test ecology in the sense that in Mongolia, it's almost unthinkable not to help family members when they're struggling with a task. There's a real sense in Mongolia of the need to collaborate and support other people in the family and the community. It's a very much, that's how people survive in the harsh environment in many Mongolian environments, such as, you know, the desert or whatever, where it can be very wild and cold, etc. So it's a normal thing to help people, but in this particular context, this reflects, for example, difficulties of quality assurance, as the interviewer had to try and prevent the respondent from involving other people. And that was typical of many observations that I made in Mongolia, and it highlighted some quite significant challenges for quality assurance. So that's one example. Okay, so now I want to move then briefly to why we should be using process data and assessment. So on the left-hand side, we've got some positives. One simple answer, which often is reflected in literature actually in process data, is we can use process data because we can, because of technological advance. And a number of people in their publications talk about the way that technological development, particularly in computer-based testing, but also in the use of computational data, is driving developments in assessment and driving development and the uses of process data. So that would be because we can. But there's additional arguments which I think are quite valid, which is we use process data because we should. And Ursula can go and raise a number of interesting points in their 2020 paper about why we should use process data. And I think in many ways I would agree with them that, for example, when we're using computer-based tests, we have an obligation in the design process to ensure effective user experience and engagement with test items, for example, around item and platform navigation. I feel it's our obligation to understand those processes. So we should be using it for those purposes. But there are also, on the right-hand side there, a number of people who ask quite significant, important questions about some of the challenges of process data. For example, the fact that it's expensive, it's actually time-consuming. In many cases, people argue it lacks rigor. And I think by that, they mean sort of professional standards in terms of how we treat and approach process data. And I think those are also very good points. And yesterday in the lecture, I argued that we need to make strong interpretation and use arguments. We need to make validity arguments around the uses, the collection and use and interpretation and use of process data. And the second point there is that there are interpretive, ethical, and consequential challenges. The data doesn't speak for itself. We need to interpret it, and we need to use sound theory, rigorous theory as we make those inferences. And we need to make, as I say, we need to validate its use. But it can have ethical and consequential challenges as well. It's not insignificant, for example, when we start to use video recordings of assessments, or when people know that the data is going to be used, the log data is going to be used, etc. And Gavin Brown has written recently on those kind of questions. So let me just dig a little deeper into the uses of process data to build on yesterday's discussion. So the first one then is to inform test and item design. And here, as these quotes say, it can tell us about whether students engage with tests in the intended ways, and thereby contribute to assessment design and validating score meaning. So that's the first point. I think for me that becomes a bit of a no-brainer when you get into computer-based testing, that we really need to do our homework to check whether students are engaging with the tasks in the way we intended. And computer-based testing really makes that very relatively easy to do that. For example, using eye tracking in test development, we can actually very carefully observe and understand how people at different levels of ability and in different groups engage with the test items. So it's very helpful for those purposes. The second point, which I will go into much more depth tomorrow, I should say, is about using process data for validity and validation. I'm not going to spend too much time on that because I will discuss it tomorrow. But again, this is about, for example, in Kane and Miss Levy's work, about checking process models, confirming process models. Are people engaging with the test in the way that the model would predict, and so on. The third one is quality control and remote proctoring. So as I've said earlier in the lecture, very often now webcam and audio data is collected as routine parts of remote proctoring. And that can be used for flagging potential violations of test protocols, potentially cheating, other threats to data quality. I think it raises an interesting point about what is normal and normal test-taking behavior. Because remote proctoring is used very frequently now for capturing when people do tests at home to make sure that they're following the protocols for test taking at home. But in order to know what is a violation of that test protocol, we really need to understand what the home environment looks like. And the home environment is not the same environment as a test taking center, and it has all sorts of valid threats to validity, which are nothing to do with cheating. So, for example, when a phone rings or a child comes and disturbs their parent during test taking, it's not necessarily about cheating. And so there's quite a lot of work to do there in understanding the ecology of test taking at home and how that's different from test taking in a classroom or examination center. The fourth, and I think probably final use of process data is an extension of the test. So that's where we can model and use process data to dig deeper into ideas around proficiency. So we're moving away from just using a test score or product to having more granular data that can inform our understanding about proficiency. And at a straightforward level, that might be something like response times. Can we model on particular items how people at different levels of ability, how quickly they take a test item? And the people who work on this topic clearly point out that to answer a question more rapidly does not always reflect higher proficiency. It's very much item specific, and it may well be group specific. But we can model proficiency around using process data, not just with response times, but with also using other approaches, particularly with using things like eye tracking, but even to some extent, think aloud protocols can tell us about how people at different levels of ability engage with test items. So just to finish then today, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about off-label uses of process data. And this discussion is informed by yesterday's lecture and the discussion that followed, but also drawing on the work of Bruno Zumbu, who actually is a friend and colleague of mine. And Bruno came to the University of East Anglia in 2015 and gave a lecture which is available on YouTube, and I put the link there on the screen. And he talked about off-label uses of tests. Now, I think Bruno was talking in general terms about how we might use a test for a particular purpose that it wasn't intended for. So when the designers of that test had not intended it to be used in this particular way. But I think here we can dig a bit deeper and say, is it possible that people might use process data in a way that the original test designers and test administrators have not intended? And so it's off-label in that sense. Well, clearly, process data provides a very rich source of information about respondent characteristics and behavior. And when there is large data sets of process data, it's potentially very valuable for all sorts of valid, ethically valid uses of that data. However, it does raise a number of legal and ethical questions about consent, data protection, and consequences. And personally, I feel a little bit uneasy about this area, because I feel that one of the difficulties with process data is when you have, for example, a large publicly available or researcher available set of process data, that people will mine that data potentially for a whole set of interesting stimulating uses, which the test taker might not have been aware of at the time, and maybe didn't give their full consent to. Now, it's fine to say that, that you can have some kind of GDPR phrasing in the consent forms where people talk about additional uses relating to the performance and characteristics of the tested population, fine. But really, I would question whether when we collect and use process data, whether those kind of general descriptions are acceptable, because in many cases, people participating in large-scale assessments or high-stakes assessments are not really in a position to question what data is collected and used. And I think we need to be a little bit more upfront and certainly conscious about the ethical and legal questions around the uses and collection and use of processed data, in particular for off-label uses. So that brings me to the end of the lecture. Thank you very much for listening, and tomorrow's lecture will be on the validity and validation of